Chapter 12. Out in the Open. Pete looked at the broken pieces of the shattered mug scattered on the floor, a gruesome yet factual parody of his life. He had invested the last 7 months of his life in this app, and now it was not accessible. He was sure that when he would be going to tell Sebastian about it, he was going to kill Pete. He was due to show the app to the investors in a couple of hours, and Pete had caused to screw that up. Pete thought that he should just get up, walk out, and make his way to California to Tosh, and try to disappear by himself, without any help from Sebastian. However, Pete soon discarded that idea. He did not have his ID with him, which could make it dangerous for him to travel even a little distance, let alone to California. Well, I have to face the music with someone. Why not Sebastian? Pete thought to himself. He picked up the receiver and his secretary said from the other side, "Sir? Janet, can you have Sebastian come over to my workstation, please?" he asked her urgently. "Very well, sir," she replied politely. When Sebastian entered, he looked at Pete's ashen face and said, "Tell me you have solved it. Why are you looking like you have seen a ghost? Is everything okay?" Instead of answering, Pete pointed to the screen where the ransomware message was still open. Sebastian read the message and looked at Pete and whispered in a deadly voice, "Tell me you were not that stupid. Please tell me you were not this stupid, Pete. Damn it, you fool. I have $3 billion of new investment relying on this freaking application." Pete was surprised by Sebastian's reaction. It was milder than he had expected, and he looked at him, sure that the news was going to sink in any time, and that Sebastian was going to physically assault him. "I expected better from you, Pete. Follow me." Sebastian was being cold to him, yet he was, by no means, reacting in any manner that Pete had expected. Even though Pete was reluctant to follow Sebastian anywhere at this point, Pete got up to follow him since he had no choice. To his surprise, Sebastian led him to his own office and motioned him toward his own chair. "Sit and complete your work, please. And do not even think about opening any of your personal accounts from this building ever again." Pete was flabbergasted. He looked at Sebastian with his mouth agape. "What?" Pete could not say anything with the relief that was flooding his body and mind. "You?" he questioned. "This is why I was calling you a fool. Not because you thought the security system was foolproof. I had hopes it was. Your faith in me is not your flaw. The reason I called you stupid was that I had not expected a hacker of your caliber not to have a backup of a backup stored on another server in the cloud somewhere. Now please pay attention and make this work for me. You have less than half an hour. What are you going to do about the Chinese? They know now that I am here. Don't worry, as long as you are here, no one can get to you. The building is a fortress, yet the Chinese are never to be trusted." Pete started working and managed to deliver the flawlessly working app within the time frame that Sebastian had given. Investors were already sitting in the conference room waiting for it before he was done with it. He made sure that it worked. It was a success, and Sebastian wanted him to continue his work. Sebastian's master plan was to shift completely to automated algo trading, allowing firms an unmanned application, while firing all the human traders with their exorbitant bonus payout. And this was not only for his firm, but initially over 100 such firms. His plan was to have all the hedge fund firms eliminate their traders for his algo trading software. He envisioned that eventually, every investment firm around the globe would use his software, much like how the Bloomberg terminals penetrated the market way back then. Sebastian envisioned his program will reduce the trading floor staff to maybe 2 highly qualified software engineers, just to make sure the software worked correctly. It was a win-win for Sebastian. He would get a commission on all trades and 35% of the generated profit, which would amount to billions of dollars annually. This was a game changer if all worked well with this application and was adopted globally, as his firm stood to make around $50 billion in revenue annually for the first 2 years, and $100 billion per annum in the next 3 to 5 years. After a week, Tosh called Pete and said that she was going to the hospital. The pain had started early and that she thought the baby was coming. Pete, in a panic, went to see Sebastian immediately and told him that he had promised that he would be back as soon as the baby would be arriving and that he had completed what he started. Sebastian, who was a hardened businessman, did not understand what Pete wanted to be there for. It was a risk, in his opinion. However, he could not refuse, seeing how desperate Pete was. So he had Roderick take Pete to the jet and had him fly back to California. During the time Pete had been working for Sebastian Farrow, the police and the FBI cybercrime division had not been idle. They had kept a close eye on Tosh, even though they did not suspect her of being a part of the main operation. They knew that she was close with Pete, and after they found out that she was pregnant, they had kept an even closer eye on her. Richard and Julia both had been of the opinion that Pete was sentimental, and that he was sure to show up when the baby came due. The police had instructed the whole hospital staff to be on high alert for Pete. Every member of the hospital staff had a picture of Pete, and they were all given a number to call as soon as they spotted him. When Tosh came in on the night of June 20th to the hospital, every nurse in the maternity ward was prepared to call the number. As Richard and Julia had predicted, Pete was there as soon as he could. Tosh, who had gone into labor in the evening, was still inside of the labor room some 14 hours later, reaching a dilation of 5 centimeters. The baby could not come until it was dilated 10 centimeters. While the police had been waiting, it was communicated to authorities that there was a change in the severity of the operation, and that the job of arresting Pete would be handed off to the SWAT team. This change might have been made by Richard, who wanted Pete to suffer. The more severe the punishment he was able to endure, the better. Meanwhile, Pete, who had just gotten to the waiting room where his soon-to-be father-in-law was sitting, greeted him and asked how Tosh was.
"She is still in labor. I told her this was not something she should do, but she didn't listen to me."
The man was in tears. He was anticipating suffering from the same trauma he had gone through when Tosh had been born and his wife had passed away because of it. At that time, he was able to handle the pain because he had to look after his baby daughter. She had helped him get over the pain. But now, if something happened to her, he would not be able to handle it. He was old now, and no parent wanted to see their child suffer so much. As soon as he finished giving Pete an update on her condition, a doctor came into the room and asked the 2 men standing there who the father was.
"I am,"
Pete replied. He could hear Tosh moaning in the next room as her contractions got more and more frequent. The doctor, who was standing in front of Pete, told him in a calm voice as though he was discussing the weather.
"Sir, we need to make a decision. Tosh has been in labor for over 16 hours. The baby is getting restless and she is exhausted and is not able to go on. We have to do a cesarean now and need your approval."
Pete looked at Tosh's father for his approval, since she was first his daughter. He nodded his head and Pete signed the papers immediately. After signing the various documents, Pete waited with Tosh's father. He had butterflies in his stomach. He was going to be a father soon and couldn't wait for the moment when he would hold his baby. He was also anxious because he had a suspicion that a few of the nurses were looking at him for a bit too long and a bit too frequently. He was starting to think that he might have made a mistake by coming, but since he had been there for a good half hour and nothing had happened, he decided to stay for a while longer, which turned out to be another big mistake on his part. After a few more minutes of waiting, they heard the sound of a baby crying. Baby Sibby had just been born on the 21st of June, 2016. He was a healthy boy of 6 pounds and 7 ounces. Pete hugged his father-in-law because they were both happy.
"You can come in now,"
the nurse on duty inside of the labor room told the 2 men standing there, holding hands and half-hugging each other.
"Thank God,"
Tosh's dad said out loud, with a sigh of relief. The doctors left the room to give the family some privacy while the nurse inside covered up Tosh, who looked a lot thinner than Pete remembered her to be. She also looked sick, but she had the sweetest smile on her face. As soon as the 2 men entered the room, Tosh's father in the lead, she looked up. Seeing her father first, she smiled. And then the smile faded and was replaced with an expression of disbelief as her eyes fell on Pete, who was just behind her father. She looked at Pete for a long moment as though she was deciding if he was real or not. And then she whispered,
"Oh no, Pete. What are you doing here? I told you I was not going to leave you alone at this time. I wanted to be here for you, babe."
Tosh held the baby toward her father, still looking at Pete, who crowded around her father's shoulder to have his first look at his baby boy.
"What are you going to name him?"
he asked her softly.
"Sibby,"
she said without hesitation. As soon as Tosh said the words, she fell over onto her side, her eyes rolling back into her skull. The EKG machine started to beep incessantly. A nurse rushed into the room as soon as the machine started beeping, and before the 2 men knew it, they were pushed up against the wall by the influx of doctors and nurses in the room. The EKG monitoring the heart rate for Tosh was dropping 120, 101, 90, 75, and 60. It continued to drop rapidly, not even giving the doctors any time to react. The doctors frantically tried to revive Tosh, but she started having seizures. Pete was looking at the activity in stunned disbelief, while Tosh's dad repeated the words,
"Oh, God. No, please, not again."
It was in the midst of all this that Pete heard a doctor say urgently,
"Call the Code Blue team."
He then began to pump her chest while the nurse pumped air into her mouth. Meanwhile, Pete could see that the EKG monitor reading kept dropping 50, 40, 30, 20, and then 10. Never once did it climb back up again. By then, all three in the room, the two grown men and young little Sibby, were crying. The two men had silent tears dripping from their eyes, while Sibby was echoing all the anguish they were feeling with his tiny, feeble little voice. As the Code Blue team arrived with the defibrillator, Pete heard a further commotion coming from the hallway. Rough voices were shouting at people to move out of the way.
"Get back! Move! Clear the way, ma'am! Official business! Move along now!"
He continuously heard the voice shouting orders, and soon he saw who was speaking. It was Inspector Griffith of the Cybercrime Unit. Behind him, a whole SWAT team entered the small labor room, where Tosh was still fighting for her life. The doctor, who had handed Tosh off to the Code Blue team, shouted at the SWAT team in anger.
"Can you not see that we are in the middle of an emergency? Do you fools not understand that this is a hospital, where one small mistake can cost someone their life? Do you cowboys think that this is your playground? This man that you are here to arrest has not taken another man's life. As someone who deals in life and death bargains all day long, I think you should cut him some slack, at least right now. He is holding his newborn son, for Christ's sake."
The angry outburst from the doctor made the SWAT men cowed, who were all taller than him and carrying machine guns. The whole team filed out of the labor room like meek children, who had been told off by the teacher and sent out of the classroom for punishment. They all waited outside for Pete, and no one dared to enter the room again. Inspector Griffith was also looking ashamed of his conduct. The doctor had more words for him.
"I will be sure to discuss your behavior with the mayor and your respective captains."
The inspector stalked out of the room without a word, realizing that the doctor was a friend of the mayor and that this was not an idle threat. The doctor then turned to face Pete and said,
"I have no idea what you have done, but I hope you get to be a father to your son, and that too in a better way than this. Now I suggest you go out and meet your fate head on. Delaying the inevitable won't change it. I just bought you enough time to be with your son."
Pete kissed his son on the forehead, took one final look at Tosh, and walked out of the room.
"Pete Hendrickson, you are under arrest for the murder of Helen Parkinson and unauthorized access of Heavenview Hospital data breach, and for tampering with hospital devices that resulted in the death of the victim,"
stated Agent Griffith in a low voice, still conscious of what the doctor had said. Pete could not figure out who was Helen Parkinson and who was behind leaking all the information that only a team member would know. He was now sure that Richard had talked to the police and made a deal. Or maybe it was the corporate hedge fund CEO, or the payback job from the Chinese. He did not have definitive answers, and his mind was still reeling from what he had seen inside of the labor room. He was not sure what to think anymore. Everything was going against what he wanted for himself and his team. For himself and Tosh. His new family was now on the brink of ending. Please pick up the second book, Rise of the CEOs and We Are Back, from the Dark Cumulus series at your nearest bookstore or on Amazon.com.